Before the dazzling European courts that helped form Anne Boleyn the young woman, there were two very different places that shaped Anne's earliest world: Blickling Hall in Norfolk and Hever Castle in Kent. These weren't simply family homes, they were symbols of ambition, identity and status, the physical spaces that tell us who the Boleyns were before Anne ever stepped into the spotlight of history. Let's step back into those landscapes and explore the two estates most closely connected with Anne Boleyn's childhood and her family story. Before Hever Castle, the Boleyn family home was Blickling Hall, and long before the elegant red brick mansion we know today was built in the reign of James I, there stood an earlier manor house on the site, one that was closely associated with the Boleyn family during the late 15th and very early 16th centuries. The Blickling estate itself is ancient, recorded in the Domesday Book and showing evidence of occupation long before the Tudor period. But its association with the Boleyns began in the 15th century, when Anne Boleyn's great-grandfather Geoffrey Boleyn acquired the manor as part of his rise into the landed gentry. Geoffrey rose from prosperous London mercer to Lord Mayor of London, and Blickling formed part of the estates that marked his family's growing wealth and status. On his death in 1463, his Norfolk properties, including Blickling, passed to his son Sir William Boleyn, and it was here that William and his wife, Lady Margaret Butler, made their principal residence. Theirs was an important marriage alliance. Margaret Butler was the daughter and co-heiress of the Earl of Ormond, bringing both prestige and valuable Irish-connected claims into the Boleyn family. Blickling was more than simply a comfortable country residence. It was the physical expression of the family's new status, wealth and dynastic ambition. It was at Blickling that William and Margaret raised their children, including their son Thomas Boleyn, the future diplomat and courtier and father of Mary, Anne and George. By the end of the 15th century, Blickling was at the heart of Boleyn family life, and it's very possible that some or even all of Thomas and Elizabeth's children were born here. If Anne Boleyn was born before 1505, the year that Thomas inherited his father's Kent estates and shifted his main residence to Hever, then Blickling is the most likely candidate for her birthplace, which is why the site remains so strongly associated with Anne today. The house that stood there in the Boleyns' time was not the one that visitors see today. The present Blickling Hall, with its grand Jacobean architecture, was built in the early 17th century, after the old manor was demolished, but it occupies the same landscape and estate that formed the backdrop to the Boleyn family's Norfolk life. After Thomas Boleyn inherited the Kent properties and established Hever as his principal seat, Blickling eventually passed out of Boleyn ownership and into the hands of new families, before its decline and later rebuilding in the Stuart period. Yet the memory of the Boleyn connection endured, and today it's still a place of pilgrimage for those interested in the Boleyns and their story. Now let's move on to Hever Castle. Long before Anne Boleyn was born, there was Hever Castle, a medieval stronghold whose stones would one day witness the beginnings of one of England's most famous queens. But Hever's story begins centuries earlier. Hever Castle's origins stretch back to the late 14th century. In 1308, a manor known as Hever Cobham stood here. But it was only in 1383, when John de Cobham received a royal licence to crenellate, that the castle as we know it, with its gatehouse, walled bailey towers and moat, began to take shape. Originally, this was a defensive residence, a fortified site with a great hall at its centre, flanked by kitchens, stables and service buildings, all protected behind stone walls. Within the inner bailey was the heart of medieval domestic life. the hall and service spaces for cooking, storage, livestock and daily work. The solar and great chamber in the west wing served as private family space, while the east wing contained domestic offices and guest chambers. This was a working castle, both a home and a stronghold. The medieval castle passed through several hands, but its future was transformed in 1462 when Geoffrey Boleyn purchased Hever. Geoffrey's investment in landed property was the first step on his family's rise into the Tudor elite. But just a year later, Geoffrey died and the castle passed to his son, William Boleyn. William continued the work begun by his father, making Hever more comfortable and elegant. Around this time, larger windows were added to the Great Hall, and part of the hall was partitioned into a parlour space, a sign of rising tastes and social standing. These changes weren't dramatic rebuilds on the scale of later Tudor palaces, but they were meaningful. They made Hever a home worthy of a family on the rise. William's son, Thomas, inherited both the castle and his family's ambitions. In the early 1500s, he continued to update the property in line with fashionable Tudor tastes. He added a spiral stone staircase linking the parlour with the family's first floor apartments. He also lowered ceilings and introduced fireplaces in what had been open, hearth-heated rooms. These changes made the castle warmer, more private and more sophisticated, less a fortress and more a comfortable noble residence. So by the early 16th century, Hever was no longer just an old stone castle. It was the family seat of the Boleyns, a physical symbol of their stature, influence and international ambitions. Thomas's growing career at court, from royal diplomacy to noble connections, was mirrored in the changes at Hever. It was into this house, newly updated, architecturally comfortable and socially connected, that Anne Boleyn would spend her early childhood. And later, the castle would not only act as Anne's family home, but also her sanctuary and refuge away from court, and the place that she probably made the decision that would not only completely change her life, but also change the course of English history. By the early years of the 16th century, Blickling and Hever stood as twin markers of the Boleyn family's rise. Norfolk roots built on mercantile success and noble alliance, and a Kentish seat that reflected Thomas Boleyn's growing influence at court. These were the worlds that shaped Anne before Mechelen and France, before Henry VIII, and before the whirlwind of politics that would follow. Worlds built by generations before her, whose ambitions helped carry her on to the European and then the English stage. In the next part of my documentary series on Anne Boleyn, we'll follow Anne beyond these family estates as she leaves England for the courts of Margaret of Austria and France, an experience that would transform not only her education and outlook, but ultimately the course of English history. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.